June the 22nd, 1941. Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa, his invasion of the Soviet Union. An ill-equipped Russian Air Force is caught off guard. But within 2 years, aircraft like the Yak-3 fighter turn the tide in what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War. This is the Yakovlev Yak-9. It was the ultimate form of an aircraft that was designed in 1939 to satisfy an official requirement for a new generation of Russian single-seat combat aircraft. As the Great Patriotic War dragged on, these Yakovlev fighters evolved into an effective opponent for the Luftwaffe's legendary Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Alexander Yakovlev's original design was promising. It made its public debut in the 1940 May Day flypast, while Russia was still basking in the false security of Stalin's non-aggression pact with Hitler. But a year later, on the eve of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's surprise attack on Russia, the Yak fighters were still not in full production. Most Russian fighter aircraft were outmoded designs, and Russia was about to be invaded again. In Russia, the recollection and commemoration of the experience of war is part of the way of life. On Kutuzovsky Prospect, the western gateway to Moscow, there is a victory arch that dates from the Napoleonic Wars of the early 1800s. It celebrates Mother Russia's victory over Napoleon and symbolizes her ability to repel invaders from the West. Like Napoleon, Hitler saw Russia as a great prize, the answer to his problem of lack of living space or Lebensraum. He also saw Russia as a society ill-prepared for war against his own mighty forces, superbly equipped for battle on Russia's sweeping landscape and in the air above it. Hitler was right. Russia was ill-prepared. But he underestimated the spirit with which the Russian people would defend their vast motherland. This is a Soviet fighter pilot called Mikhailov, who, with his ammunition exhausted, sacrificed his life and his Yak-3 to bring down a German fighter. "50 years on, stories of courage and sacrifice like his are still fresh in the minds of the Russians, and the uniquely Russian plains in which their parents and grandparents fought the air battles of the Great Patriotic War have themselves become legends. But in the early years, the Russian aircraft industry was slow to establish its own identity. Before the revolution of 1917, most of the scout or fighter aircraft of the Imperial Russian Air Force were Russian versions of French and British designs built under license. After the revolution, interest in aircraft waned as Lenin's Bolsheviks concentrated on establishing a new social order. But with the beginning of the Civil War, it became obvious that the Red Army needed air support, and on May Day 1918, aircraft were given a prominent place in the military parade. In December 1918, Nikolai Zhukovsky became the founding head of the Central Aero and Hydrodynamics Institute, known as TSAGI. Zhukovsky was the father figure of a group of young students of aeronautics, and TSAGI was to become the major center for Russian aviation research. It also developed some of the most talented designers and engineers in Russian aviation. The Red Air Force needed a workhorse, and for convenience, chose to copy the British de Havilland DH-9A. The Russian version was known as the R-1. R for razvedchik, meaning reconnaissance. Most of the Russian aircraft produced in the 1920s were strongly influenced by British and German designs. But gradually, a new generation of bright young Soviet designers began to impose their ideas on the developing industry. Nikolai Polikarpov's special area of interest was fighter aircraft, but one of his first major successes was a reconnaissance design to replace the R-1. It was a simple biplane called the R-5. It entered service in 1930, and when production ended in 1937, 6,000 had been built. Another 1927 Polikarpov design for a basic trainer was to become a legend, although the first prototype would not even leave the ground. It was called the U-2, and like the R-5, was strong and simple. It served not only as a trainer, but as air ambulance, artillery spotter, even night bomber. It caused German infantry many sleepless nights in World War II. Female combat pilots, the night witches, would often cut their engines and glide their U-2s in behind German lines, dropping bombs on the sleeping troops. More than 40,000 U-2s were built. They were still a common sight in Russian skies many years after the end of the Great Patriotic War. Polikarpov's fortunes in the late 1920s were mixed. He was commissioned to design a fighter, but his progress was considered slow, so he was imprisoned and sentenced to be shot. The sentence was never carried out. In 1933, he regained political favor and produced two fighter designs. The I-15 was a streamlined biplane with excellent performance, but the second design, the I-16, was revolutionary. In an era of biplanes, it was a low-winged monoplane with retractable landing gear, the first fighter of this kind to enter service anywhere in the world. It had a maximum speed of 283 miles an hour, which was very fast for that period. By 1935, the I-16 was arriving in numbers in Red Air Force fighter squadrons, and over the next 2 years, several improved versions were introduced. Stalin was so pleased with the I-16 that he presented Polikarpov with a personal limousine and the Order of Lenin. The I-16 was not easy to handle. Its takeoff and landing speeds were fast. It tended to spin viciously in tight turns. Red Air Force pilots said that if you could fly an I-16, you could fly anything. When the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, the wooden-framed I-16 was the Red Air Force's premium fighter. Improvements had taken the design as far as it could go. At first, it was successful, fighting on the side of the Republicans who called it Mosca, the Fly. But then it encountered an enemy that belonged to a new generation. The German Messerschmitt Bf-109, with its sleek lines and powerful inline engine, was fighting for the Condor Legion of Hitler's nationalist allies. The result of the encounter was clear. The I-16, known to the fascist nationalists as the Rat, was all but finished. Stalin had been a champion of the development of the I-16. It suited his philosophy of sticking with the proven and familiar. But when it failed against the Messerschmitt, it fell from grace with Stalin, and so did Polikarpov. Unlike many other designers of the period, Polikarpov was not executed in Stalin's savage purges of the military, but in effect his career was over. In early 1939, several young aircraft designers were asked to submit proposals for new fighter designs. Alexander Yakovlev was a man on the way up. He began his career as a mechanic at Moscow's Central Airfield in the late 1920s. In 1939, he was 33 years old, had a reputation as a ladies' man and driver of fast cars. He was also in favor with Stalin, having recently designed two successful trainers, the UT-1 and UT-2. The Yakovlev Bureau was considered to have a virtual monopoly in the design of light aircraft, and it now made a strong bid to assume the mantle that had so long been worn by Polikarpov, leadership in the design of high-performance fighters. Throughout 1939, the Yakovlev Bureau worked on the development of a new design that would be competitive with the German Messerschmitt. But whether it would be ready to fight when Stalin's inevitable war with Hitler began was another question. As design work proceeded and Germany was plunging into war in Europe, Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, buying time that had to be well used by the designers of war materials. The full resources of TSAGI, the Central Aero and Hydrodynamics Institute, were used to test the concept and refine the layout of the I-26, as the new prototype was called. By late 1939, design and construction work was complete, and in January 1940 it flew for the first time. It went into limited production almost immediately, designated Yak-1. In the meantime, Soviet air power received another public defeat in the winter war against Finland in late 1939. Obsolete Russian heavy bombers failed to immobilize the Finns, and the Red Air Force lost almost 1,000 aircraft, compared with less than 100 lost by the Finns. The poor Russian showing was not unnoticed by Hitler. By late 1940, in spite of his non-aggression pact with Stalin, Hitler's generals were planning Operation Barbarossa, his invasion of the Soviet Union. German intelligence estimated that given Stalin's purges and Russian losses in Spain and Finland, it would take 4 years for the Red Air Force to rebuild to its 1937 strength. In Russia, the rebuilding was already beginning, and one of its major components was an abundant Russian resource, wood. The Yak-1 had wooden wing frames, but another new fighter, the Lavochkin LAGG-1, was built almost completely of wood. Its skin was made of layers of wood laminated with fiberglass. It was very strong, but heavy and underpowered, and pilots called it Lakirovanny Garantированный Grob, or guaranteed varnished coffin. The third bureau involved in fighter design in 1939 was run by a partnership between Artyom Mikoyan and Mikhail Gudevich. Their MiG design bureau was to become a legend in Russian aviation. Their prototype fighter, the I-200, was designed and built in just 4 months. It entered production in 1940 and became known as the MiG-1. In this parade celebrating Soviet youth in